So this is a re-record of a previous video that I did and removed because I saw there was a small discrepancy in some of the numbers. The video was about the math behind Infusion and whether or not it's good. So we're going to be doing the same exact thing as we did before. Now, that being said, I have figured out what the discrepancy was, and it is a problem with the game. It's a bug in the UI, or just I'm not exactly sure if it's a bug or not, but it's labeled incorrectly. So the first thing we're going to do for this testing session is I'm going to show you what I have. So my Guardian ranks, I have no modifiers under the offense section, so there's no gun damage, crit, or really anything there. No splash damage. I assume that's the same as grenade, but it might not be in this game. So we're also on Sanctuary, so we have no Mayhem modifiers. I have no pieces of gear that are going to modify my gun damage. So pretty much this is just straight up raw damage. Now, Too Lazy didn't read. I still don't really like this skill that much. I think it's okay if you're really hard and fast going to use only normal weapons. If you're willing to use elemental weapons, it's almost always going to be a damage down to go Infusion. I think they need to tweak it. I won't really go into how I want them to tweak it again. You can make up your mind after you see the math that I've kind of done, because it's all Borderlands is all about personal choice. So if you want to run something, run it. But at least with this, you're going to know what you're getting. So the other TLDR is Tempest. So what's weird about Tempest is at its max level, it gives you 30% elemental damage and 20% shock damage, or at least that's what it says. Now, through a lot of testing and working around in the formulas, I've found that Tempest is actually not that. The base elemental damage of 30% is correct. That's what I've been calculating and seeing in-game and to my spreadsheet. But the shock damage increase was not working. And it took me a while to figure out why, and that is because it is not a 20% increase. It is listed incorrectly, or they didn't put it into the formula correctly, either one, but it is only a 10% bonus. So instead of 4% per level, it is actually 2% per level, with 10% being the max. So that being said, Tempest is a little bit weaker. It's still an amazing skill, and it's also going to modify sort of how the Infusion calibration works. So what I'm going to do for this is, and this is going to be a little math heavy, it is in depth. So I'm going to spawn a vehicle here. It is armor type. So we're going to have to figure that into all of our calculations. I created a spreadsheet to make this a little bit easier, a little bit more visual for you guys. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to pull up the spreadsheet now. Let's see, which is that one. So you should see a number of columns, a number of weapons, and a number of rows. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and record a lot of my guns as we go, and this is going to be from the card to actually hitting them, and then hitting them after we get Infusion, and then hitting them again after we have Infusion and Tempest. And I'll demonstrate why Tempest is wrong, because it is a little obscure, because you already have the elemental buff and it doesn't affect fire or corrosive, etc., etc. So let's go ahead and get into the recording portion. So I have an Unforgiven here. Its card damage is 1053. So let's go ahead and record that. And then we're going to record my Lyuda right here, which is 1037. Whoops. And then we're going to record this Westergun, which is 673. So I picked these weapons specifically because I had them. They were easy. They were full 100% elemental or not, and there is a shock weapon in here. So having that out of the way, let's go ahead and shoot the vehicle and see what numbers pop up. So I have my Unforgiven, and my build If you didn't notice before, I have not spent any skill points. So my build is pretty much devoid of any gun damage, anything. So we expect a 20% drop from the card because kinetic on armor, and that's about what we see here. So 843 is the number that pops out. If we were to do a quick calculation, we'd probably see that that's about 80%. Moving on, let's do it the same thing with the Lyuda, 518. So we have 518. And let's do the same thing with Westergun. And this is going to get a little repetitive, a little boring. I apologize, but I want to be really thorough. So you guys can watch like a 15-20 minute video, or not even, and get what you need out of it. So let's see, 438 is the number we need here. Now we're going to get into infusions. So infusion of fire, shock, corrosive, and then we're going to re-record over here for tempest numbers. And we'll probably skip base for now. It's not going to be that important. I'm going to show some of the math after we put it down, and you'll very clearly see what's happening. So let's go into fire. So we need to grab our points in infusion. Grab the fire infusion, and then we're going to start over and shoot it. So when you split damage types, it's going to show two numbers. So it is a 506 and a 211. Remember that 506. We're going to see that every time we shoot this gun. That is the leftover remaining, however you want to look at it, portion of infusion. So infusion only converts 40%, so that's the remaining 60%. So we're going to record that 211, and then we're going to switch to the Lyuda. And the Lyuda will deal 518 damage. Now notice that number didn't change. We expect that. We converted from fire to fire. No elemental change. No, it doesn't affect armor any differently. So the number is exactly the same. Moving to the Westergun, we have a 263 and a 135. So 263 and a 135. Now notice our damage went down here. And the reason is, for both of these, that kinetic and shock deal better against armor than the element that they were converted into, which is fire. Fire does very poorly against it. So let's go ahead and move over to shock, and we'll see with the Westergun in our hands right now, it rolls 438. Now this 438, we'll notice, is the same as the card, or is the same as the base damage. So it's the very same thing that the Lyuda went through. We're converting to the same element, no damage change. So with the Lyuda, we see a 270 and a 311. Notice that 311 keeps popping up. Plus 270. Yeah, it was 270. And then we'll do the Unforgiven. So 506 plus 274. So that gives us a 780. And then finally, we're going to need to grab this corrosive. So let's dump some points into health, because they won't really affect our calculations at all. And we'll pull out corrosive. So the 506 plus 737. So 506 plus 737. And then we will switch to the Lyuda and get 311, 726. Plus 726. And then finally Westergun, and that is 471 and 263. 471 and 263. And some of these I might have to look back at, like right after I say it, because there's so many numbers that I'm saying and that I'm seeing and I'm writing that I'll probably get confused at some point. So now that we have all those points, we've recorded the numbers, and we can check them in a minute, but first we're going to take points in Tempest. And this is where things get a little interesting because of the tooltip being wrong on Tempest. So we can see here clearly it says elemental damage goes up by 30, shock damage is further increased by 20%. Now, it took me a long time to figure this problem out because of the way it's worded. Borderlands has weird formulas a lot of the time, so I did is it a multiplicative increase? Is it affecting somehow the way armor modifier or shot or shield or flesh modifiers work. So I had to go through a lot of calculations when it was a very simple tooltip error. So let's go ahead and get back into the damage recording so we can get through this, and then we can get into some of the fun stuff. So we see 506 and 958. And actually, let's convert back to fire. So we have 506 and 274. So plus 506 plus 274. Now, these numbers on the bottom rung here should be, and this should be 780, not this one. We're not recording the base for this video. But this 780 should always be higher than the Infusion without Tempest. So all of these bottom numbers should be higher than their respective versions up here, and we will see that. So let's fire the Lyuda, 674. Notice it's higher, and we'll get through this. 368, 175. 368, 175. Notice the base numbers are changing for the elemental weapons, but not the Unforgiven. And that's because the Unforgiven by default is not elemental, so it's not getting anything out of Tempest. So we have converted to shock. Let's see what we get. 506 plus 383. Plus 383. We have the Lyuda, which is for... How much health does this thing have? Let's go ahead and reset it. So let's try again. 374, or 377 and 404. Okay. 377 and 404. And then finally we have the Westergun, 613. So 613. And corrosive. So we're almost done with the recording portion of this, and bear with me, I know it kind of sucks. If you fast forwarded, I don't blame you. 506 plus 958. 506 plus 958. The Lyuda is 943 and 404. 943 and 404. And then the Westergun is 368 and 613. 368 and 613. So we've got the numbers all recorded out. And let's go ahead and take a poke at calculating some of these things by hand. So I'm going to pull this out a little bit so we can see a little bit better. And I'll go ahead and pause the game and make the spreadsheet big so we can all see it. See everything that's going on. Let me zoom out a bit now that we made it bigger. So if we take this Unforgiven, which is base card damage of 1053, and then we calculate the base damage we're expecting to see, we know that the kinetic modifier against shields is 80%. So we can expect this number times 0.8 to be our base damage. So 842, this is 843. There is a disclaimer here. Borderlands formulas have a lot of weird floors and rounding, so some of these numbers will be like one off. That is a result of that wonky rounding floor kind of stuff. So just know that these are 99.99% accurate. It is just rounding that is throwing any of them off, and it's usually only by one. I've noticed some weird stuff when I calculate like shotguns or anything with multi-pellets. I think it rounds for every pellet as well. Just a little side tangent there, but it is important to know just so you're not like, oh, your formula is wrong. It's just rounding. So if we take this this number right here and we start converting it into things, so let's figure out what our infusion damage would be. So if we take that base card damage and we multiply that by 0.8, and then we multiply that by the amount that doesn't get transformed into an element, which would be 100% minus 40%, which is 60%. So that'll be the base kinetic damage left. So we're seeing a 505 if you remember from the previous session with the video, we were seeing numbers like 506 repeatedly. So that's where that number comes from. And then let's get the elemental portion. So we take the same number we had, we multiply it by the 0.4, so that's the amount that got converted, and then we can test it against all sorts of things. So let's convert it into fire. So fire is a 50% damage reduction against armor. So we're going to multiply this by 0.5. That's going to give us 210. Now let's go ahead and put 506 here a couple times, and we can just take a look at each element separately. And I will copy this formula over. So we expect to see when we convert to fire with the Unforgiven 717 damage. Well, we're seeing 716 and a half. If we do that same conversion, we'll do the 1053 times 0.4. And let's do it for shock now. So shock loses 35% damage, so that would be 0.65. And that will come out to 237. So we see it's almost 780, and that is the number that we have cataloged in the game. So we're seeing a lot of these numbers that actually pop out in the world are the exact same things that we're recording in the spreadsheet here. So let's go ahead and do the same thing for corrosive. So we're going to do the card damage times 0.4. However, this time it is a 75% increase in damage. So we'll do 1.75. And that brings us to 1243. And that's where we're seeing our 1243 number. So we basically have recorded all the Unforgiven stuff, and the elemental weapons follow the same exact pattern. Where they get a little interesting is when we include Tempest. So we'll cover that next. So if we do the exact same thing with Tempest, we're going to get a little bit different results depending on what we use. So let's go ahead and take these numbers, and we'll do the same thing down here. So we'll take the 506 that we know we're getting from the Unforgiven, for instance, and then we will take the amount that gets converted, so 1053 times 0.4. Then we'll multiply it by the amount we're expecting to get given the damage type we're dealing. So fire against armor is halved, so we'll do 0.5. But we have Tempest now, and we know that Tempest gives us 30% increased damage, so we're going to say times 1.3. So that will give us that number, and I'm going to go ahead and copy this sum formula down, and I'm going to copy it over. So these will all be 506 as well. So we can expect to see with Tempest buff 780 damage, and that is what we get with the Tempest buff. Now if we do the same exact thing, except we convert, and let me go ahead and freeze this so I can just copy it over a little bit easier. Except we convert it at a different ratio, so this will be 65%. We would expect to see, if Tempest didn't give a bonus to shock, we would expect to see 862. Now we see 889. So if we take the tooltip, for example, we would be dealing 150% damage. So it would be 50% bonus with shock. That gives us 916, 917. That's too high. We recorded 889 in the world, and that's what matters. So if we actually go into this formula and we put in a 0.4, we end up with 889, and that is exactly what we saw in the world. And I've done this with a number of other weapons. We'll see it with a number of other weapons right here, the Lyuda and the Westergun. But I just wanted to really show that because I am claiming that Borderlands has a bug, so I wanted to show the math behind it. So let's go ahead and do the same thing for corrosive. So instead of the 0.5, we will have 1.75. It does only get the 30% bonus because it's not shock. So we're expecting to see 1464 damage, and that is what we get. So let's do the same exact thing, but for the Lyuda. So one of the cool things we can do is if we take the card damage right up here, we multiply that by the 0.6 because that's the amount we're not converting. and then we multiply that additionally by whatever weapon type we're dealing. So fire on armor isn't going to do well, so it's only a 0.5. And then we multiply that by the increase. So our base damage is getting increased by Tempest now. So we do 1.3. So we see 410, and we end up with a number, let's see, excuse me. So 0 0.6 times 0 0.5 times 1.3, and we end up with 410. And then down here we have 0.4 times 0.5. So yeah, it would be the same exact difference. So we end up with 684. And it is a little different than what we recorded. It should be 674. So my math is probably... Oh, I'm sorry. 1053 is not the base damage for the Lyuda. That's my fault. The base damage was 1037. I got scared there for a second. I thought maybe my math was wrong. So let's convert that down. So here we're seeing that the number we're getting is 674, and that is what we saw. Woo! That was close. So let's go ahead and copy this formula all the way across, and we should be able to keep our base number of 404 for the Lyuda. And then we're going to be able to convert these in much the same way. So we see the 781 is what we're picking up here. Now this would round to 782, but like I said, rounding issues. And then the final number would be 1347. We see a 1348. So we can see that the numbers are all jiving all the way throughout. Now let's go ahead and do the Wester gun just to wrap up our testing portion, and then I'll get into a little bit easier, a little bit bigger, more visual stimulation version of this, and it'll kind of help everybody understand where I'm coming from with what is Infusion and what it means. But let's go ahead and finish up Wester gun before we get into that. So before I forget, let's change our base card damage again to 673. And then we have our conversion amount. So Wester gun is going to be converted at a 0.65, not 0.5. So we copy that all the way across. Now notice we have 516 here. And some of you may have noticed that it's because we have shock. So we need to be converting this 1.3 into a 1.4. And this part down here into a 1.4, or into whatever the percentage is for that specific one. So this is our fire conversion, so it won't get it. So that's why it's 1.3 here. And then this one is 1.4 because it's the shock version. So 542, 543, 612, 613, 980. And now see, this one's a little off. So 980, this is 981. So even with rounding, this would have to round down, this would have to round up. But it's very, very, very close. So now that we got kind of like the proof portion of the episode over, and I am sorry that took so long, but I want to get into what I have actually done to look at and analyze the entire set of Infusion possibilities. And what I came down to was this. So if I take a card damage for Unforgiven, and let's say I put in a ratio of 100% armor, because all we're shooting right now is the vehicle, this is what I would come up with. And what it means is, if I have my base damage right here, it's showing how much damage I would deal if I just used a kinetic or fire or whatever kind of weapon is in my current setup. Now this top section is without Tempest. The bottom section is with Tempest. And I wanted to kind of display and calculate those separately because I want to know how many points I really have to invest to make Infusion worth it. So if we come in here, and I can actually take this formatting, I can make some special rules here so we can kind of see how this is. If it is greater than 0, then it should be green. And if it is less than 0, it should turn red. So let's go ahead and do that. And you'll see that the formulas come out to being a negative for the elements you're not converting into. So, or that you're not trying to fight against, I should say it that way. So if we're converting to corrosive in this situation, this would be our column. And the reason why it's so positive right now is because we're only fighting enemies that are made out of armor. So of course corrosive is going to be really good. You can see if we're trying to fight or if we're trying to convert into fire or shock when enemies are entirely made out of armor, that is actually going to be a downgrade for us. You'll also notice there are 0%. That happens when you're converting fire into fire or shock into shock, etc. These will pretty much always happen. Radiation has that happen as well, depending on what you're converting into. Fire and radiation interact the same against armor, so that's why you see a 0% on this one. That being said, even with or without infusion, we can see that if we just pulled out an elemental weapon, like a corrosive weapon, it'll be dealing more damage. And the reason is because we are not converting 100% of the damage. So you still have some fire, you still have some shock, you still have some kinetic. So if you had just pulled out a corrosive sniper rifle instead of a kinetic one that's converted into corrosive, you would have been dealing more damage. You can see down here where it shows 100%, that means that we converted corrosive into whatever, and it's the same damage ratio as if we had used a fully corrosive sniper rifle. And that's because the base damage that we're looking at here is already corrosive. Now, I will say, before we go down into all the Tempest section, that elemental weapons seem to take a small damage down, and depending on how you look at it, I think it's around 20%. I've tried to get some calculations with weapons that are and are not elemental with very similar or even the same gun parts, and I've seen anywhere between like 15 and 20, sometimes a little bit higher than 20. It may be that fire gets a different ratio than cryo or something like that, but it does seem to be that elemental weapons take a damage down. So these numbers are a little harsh towards infusion, a little harsh. I would say maybe at best case scenario, you're still going to be losing like 20 to 30% DPS on average, and I'll show you why. So if we look over here, this is damage without infusion versus a perfect matching. So perfect matching right here is essentially if we took our weapons and we only shot enemies properly. So whenever there was a shield, we used a shield weapon. Whenever there's armor, we used corrosive. Whenever there's health, we used fire. So that's considering the most optimal distribution, and you can argue that that's very unattainable. Nobody likes to play that way. That's all good and fine, and you're probably right, but you have to ask yourself what percentage is that gap. Because if you're looking at these numbers, these are the percentage of the damage you could be dealing. So right here, the kinetic damage without infusion is under half of the damage you could be doing with elemental. Now, if we're converting, then we see some of the numbers go down even further, and we see some of the numbers go up. So you're converting part of your kinetic damage into corrosive. Your number is getting closer. So take this all with a little bit of grain of salt. You can make the decision for yourself. Kinetic weapons tend to have higher card numbers than elemental ones, so some of these numbers are a little harsh. That being said, we can move on to the second thing that interacts with infusion, and that is Tempest. So we know that Tempest increases all elemental damage and further increases shock damage. So these numbers are going to get a little less harsh on this section. For the most part. I should say for the most part. So if we were to take a kinetic weapon and compare it to a perfect matching setup using Tempest, you'll actually see that our number got even worse. And the reason is because kinetic weapons aren't getting anything out of Tempest, inherently. So that for that 506 number we kept seeing, it doesn't go up with Tempest. So we're not scaling all of our damage. We're scaling only 40%. So unless you can convert a bigger percentage of the of infusion over, you're going to be having less of a return out of Tempest. So that already intrinsically makes Tempest not as worth each point. Now, you may say, I have nothing else to spend it on, and that's all fine depending on your build. But just know, Tempest is not worth as much when you're converting out of a kinetic weapon. Even worse, though, is if you're using a fire weapon and converting into shock, it's going to be not that great. So you can see we're converting, or we have fire, and we're converting. Like if we had converted into corrosive, we'd have been dealing 3.5 times more damage, like way more damage. So a lot of these elemental conversions are still not great, even with infusion. So you'll notice a lot of these numbers might be a little higher, but most of them are lower. So there's like a couple that are like tiny bit better. So that pretty much covers how the spreadsheet is viewing the data. Before I cut the video off, I want to show you a more realistic distribution. So obviously we're never going to see a map with all armored enemies. So let's go ahead and take that down. And this isn't a hard and fast number. I'm sort of kind of guessing. It depends on what you're fighting. Maliwans have more shields. COV have less shields. Varkids don't have shields, etc., etc. So this is a general smattering that I would say is somewhat accurate for what you're going to fight if you don't want to change your build every 3 seconds. And you're going to see that a lot of the time, these damage conversion, this infusion skill is not going to be worth it. So looking at kinetic, right here, we can see that we're not getting a huge return out of these numbers. So this is the difference with and without infusion. So converting kinetic into fire is going to give us a 4% average return. That's across all enemies if we have this distribution. Shock is going to be a little bit better, 13%. Corrosive is straight down. Now, Tempest does help us out. So if we jump down here, you'll see that fire goes up to 18%, shock goes up to 36%, and corrosive goes up by 4%. Now, what you're probably thinking is that seems really good. Like sometimes it's not that great, but sometimes it's amazing. And you're not wrong. So kinetic weapons do get a whole heck of a lot out of this, but that's also considering the fact that you're committing to using kinetic weapons on Amara. And the opportunity lost from not just using an elemental weapon is very high. You're not getting full Tempest benefits from random insert elemental gun that's strong. So yes, you can use infusion. Yes, it's going to make kinetic weapons better. You can use elemental grenades to fill in your gaps for your strength. There's some things that you can do to mitigate this problem, but just know using elements and matching the proper damage types is almost always going to do you better, especially on Amara, who already does so well with elements. But in any case, if I missed something or you have additional comments, let me know. I wanted to get this out there, especially for the Tempest tooltip problem. But yeah, let me know what you guys think. If you guys find something infusion related or a combo with a skill that I haven't noticed and it's like, wow, that really is amazing. But that is it for this episode. Thanks for watching, guys.